Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio visual podcast series on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. This audio video podcast series has 54 short speeches of approximately 20 minutes in length focused on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had seen for the country as a whole. That is what this podcast series is all about. In this 35th episode and the next one, we move on to yet another fascinating aspect of Dr. Ambedkar's persona, that is, his role as an anthropologist. In this episode, I am going to talk about his book titled Who Were the Shudras? How they became the fourth varna in the Indo-Aryan society. Let me begin by providing you the background. Dr. Ambedkar wrote this provocatively original treatise, 200 plus pages, after studying religious history of India for more than 15 years. Interestingly, this book has been inscribed to the memory of Mahatma Jyotiba Phule, whom he describes as under, and I quote, the greatest Shudra of modern India, who made the lower classes of Hindus conscious of their slavery to the higher classes, and who preached the gospel that for India, social democracy was more important than independence from foreign rule, unquote. Let me present a very brief summary of this great book in Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's own words. He starts with the riddle of the Shudras. Dr. Ambedkar says, and I quote him, any attempt to discover who the Shudras were and how they came to become the fourth varna must begin with the origin of Chaturvarnya in the Indo-Aryan society. In turn, the study must start with a study of Purusha Sukta. The Purusha Sukta is a theory of the origin of the universe. The Purusha Sukta explains how the four classes, that is, Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, how did they arise from the body of the Creator? The scheme of Purusha Sukta is unique inasmuch as it fixes a permanent warrant of precedence among the different classes, which neither time nor circumstances can alter, based on the principle of graded inequality among the four classes. In propounding the doctrine of Chaturvarnya, the Purusha Sukta plays a double game. It proceeds first to raise the real, namely the existence of the four classes in the Indo-Aryan society, to the status of an ideal. After raising the real to the status of the ideal, it proceeds to make a show of giving effect to what it regards as an ideal. This attempt of the Purusha Sukta to idealize the real and to realize the ideal is a kind of political jugglery. The principle underlying the Purusha Sukta is therefore criminal in intent and antisocial in its results. For it aims to perpetuate an illegal gain obtained by one class and an unjust wrong inflicted upon another. The equation, the equation of the different classes to different parts of body is not a matter of accident. It is deliberate. The idea behind this plan seems to discover a formula which will solve two problems. One of fixing the functions of the four classes, and the other of fixing the gradation of four classes after a preconceived plan. The latter developments of Chaturvarnya are mainly two. First is the creation of the fifth class next below the Shudras. The second is separation of the Shudras from the first three Varnas. These changes have given rise to peculiar terms such as Savarnas and Avarnas and Traivarnikas. The Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudras are Savarna. The untouchables are Atishudra, are also called Avarna. Logically, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudras are within the Chaturvarnya. The untouchables or the Atishudra are outside the Chaturvarnya. The Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudras are all within the four corners of Chaturvarnya. They are all Savarnas. Why then is the Shudra denied the right of Traivarnikas, that is to say, wearing of sacred thread? Turning to the Brahmanic view of the civil status of Shudra, what strikes one is a long list of disabilities accompanied by a most dire system of pains and penalties to which Shudra is subjected to by Brahmanic lawgivers. One is also struck by the consideration that Shudra alone has been selected by the Brahmanic lawgivers as a victim for their lawmaking authority. The question is, why was the Vaishya let off and why the fury directed towards Shudras only? The only Traivarnika who has the special rights and privileges is the Brahmin. These disabilities have no parallel anywhere else in the world. For same offenses, the punishment varies according to the community of the accused and the community of the complainant. If the complainant is a Shudra and the accused belong to any one of the three classes, the punishment is less than what it would have been if the relations were reversed. The Brahmanic law not only seeks to impose disabilities, but it also endeavors to make them permanent. It will be a crime for a Shudra to study the Vedas or hear it being pronounced, and if he does commit such a crime, his tongue should be cut or molten lead should be poured into his ear. Can anything be more barbarous? Dr. Ambedkar then turns to Shudras versus Aryans. According to Western scholars, says Dr. Ambedkar, one, the people who created Vedic literature belong to the Aryan race. Two, the Aryan race came from outside India and invaded India. Three, the natives of India were known as Dasas and Dasyus, who were racially different from the Aryans. Four, the Aryans were a white race. The Dasas and Dasyus were a dark race. Fifth, the Aryans conquered the Dasas and Dasyus. Six, the Dasas and Dasyus, after they conquered and enslaved, were called Shudras. Seven, the Aryans cherished color prejudice and therefore formed the Chaturvarnya, whereby they separated the white race from the black race, such as the Dasas and Dasyus. After a detailed examination of the Western theory of Shudras versus Aryans, Dr. Ambedkar drew conclusions which can be summarized as follows. 1. The Vedas do not know any such race as Aryan race. 2. There is no evidence in the Vedas of any invasion of India by the Aryan race and its having conquered Dasas and Dasyus, supposedly the natives of India. 3. There is no evidence to show that the distinction between Aryans, Dasas, and Dasyus was a racial distinction. 4. The Vedas do not support the contention that Aryas were different in color from Dasas and Dasyus. Turning then to Aryan against Aryans, Dr. Ambedkar says, and I quote him, those who uphold the theory of Aryan race invading India and conquering the Dasas and Dasyus fail to take note of certain verses in Rig Veda. These verses convey that there were two different communities of Aryas who were not only different but also opposed and inimical to each other. The existence of two Aryas is not a mere matter of conjecture or interpretation. Providing supporting evidence, Dr. Ambedkar argues that it seems that there are the ideologies of two different Aryan races, one believing in Chaturvarnya and the other one not believing in Chaturvarnya, who at a later stage merged into one. The most unimpeachable evidence in support of my view comes from the anthropometrical survey of Indian people. It can be seen that there is a solid foundation in anthropometry and history that there were in India two Aryan races and not one. Turning then to Shudras and Dasas, Dr. Ambedkar asks us questions. Who were the Shudras? One view is that the Dasas and Dasyus were either savages or non-Vedic Aryan tribes. Those of them that were captured in war were probably made slaves and formed the Shudra caste. According to another Vedic scholar, an upholder of the Western theory, the Shudras are the same as Dasas and Dasyus, and further, the Shudras were the non-Aryan original inhabitants of India and were in primitive and a savage state of civilization. The most unimpeachable evidence in support of my view comes from the anthropometrical survey of the Indian people. It can be seen that there is a solid foundation in anthropometry and history that there were in India two Aryan races and not one. According to the evidence of the Rig Veda, there are two categories of Aryans, the Vedic and the non-Vedic. According to Manu, in the seventh generation, a Shudra, under certain circumstances, could become a Brahmin. Such a conception would have been impossible if the Shudra was not an Aryan. That the Shudra is non-Aryan is also contrary to the view taken by the school of Arthashastra. Kautilya calls the Shudra an Aryan in the most emphatic and express terms possible. Coming to the question of Shudras having been made slaves, it is nonsense, if not mendacious. Shudras participate in the coronation of kings, that the Shudras were invited to be present at the coronation of king along with Brahmins is evidenced by description of the coronation of Yudhishthira, the eldest brother of Pandavas, which is given in the Mahabharata. Shudras were members of the two political assemblies of ancient times, namely Janapada and Paura. And as a member of these, they were entitled to a special respect, even from a Brahmin. Otherwise, there is no meaning in Manu saying that the Brahmin should not live in a country where the king is a Shudra. That means Shudras were kings. This proves that Shudras were ministers and that they were almost equal to Brahmin in number. The Shudras were not poor and lowly, they were rich. Turning to the question whether the number of Varnas were 3 or 4, Dr. Ambedkar says, there is a strong and cogent evidence to show that there were originally only 3 Varnas among the Indo-Aryans. The Rig Veda does not mention Shudra as a separate Varna. 2 Brahmanas, the Shatapatha and Taittiriya, both speak of the creation of 3 Varnas only. They do not speak about creation of the Shudras as a separate Varna. Dr. Ambedkar says, I therefore see no difficulty in concluding that there was a time when the Aryan society had only 3 Varnas and the Shudras belonged to the second Varna, that is Kshatriya Varna. Turning then to the issue of Brahmins versus Shudras. Here is what Dr. Ambedkar says, and I quote, the thesis that Shudras were Kshatriyas and if they became the 4th Varna, it was because they were degraded to that position. Why were Shudras degraded? My answer is that the degradation of the Shudra is the result of a violent conflict between the Shudras and the Brahmins. Fortunately, there is abundant evidence for it. There is a direct evidence of a violent conflict between Shudra king Sudas and Vasishtha, the Brahmin Rishi. Vasishtha and Vishwamitra were enemies. The enmity between Vasishtha and Vishwamitra was not merely an enmity between 2 priests. It was an enmity between a Brahmin priest and a Kshatriya priest. Vasishtha was a Brahmin. Vishwamitra was a Kshatriya. The dispute was going on between the Brahmins and Kshatriyas on the following points. 1. The right to receive gifts. 2. The right to teach the Vedas. The Kshatriyas had only the right to study the Vedas. He had no right to teach the Vedas. And 3. The right to officiate at a sacrifice. Kshatriya had the right to perform sacrifices but had no rights to officiate as a priest at a sacrifice. In this dispute between Vasishtha and Vishwamitra, Sudas seemed to have played an important part. Vasishtha was the family priest of Sudas. It was Vasishtha who helped him to win the battle against 10 kings. Notwithstanding this, Sudas removed Vasishtha from the office. In his place, he appointed Vishwamitra, as his Purohit who performed yajna for Sudas. This is the first deed of Sudas which created enmity between Sudas and Vasishtha. There was another deed which Sudas committed which widened and intensified the enmity. He threw into fire Shakti, the son of Vasishtha, and burned him alive. The story is reported in the Satyayan Brahmana. Understanding a history of conflict between Brahmins and Shudras helps one understand how the Shudras came to be degraded from the second Varna to the fourth Varna. The technique employed by the Brahmins for this purpose was to refuse to perform the Upanayan of a Shudra. It is by this technique that the Brahmins accomplished their end, thereby wreaked their vengeance upon the Shudras. Upanayana was one of the samskaras, and like other samskaras, its significance was just spiritual. The denial of the Upanayana to Shudras necessarily brought about a change in its significance. In addition to the spiritual significance, it acquired a social significance, which it did not have before. When Upanayana was open to everyone, Aryan as well as non-Aryan, it was not a matter of social significance. It was a common right of all. It was not a privilege of the few. Once it was denied to Shudras, its possession became a matter of honor and its denial a badge of servility. The denial of Upanayana to the Shudras introduced a new factor in the Indo-Aryan society. It made Shudras look up to the higher classes as their superiors and enabled the three higher classes to look down upon Shudras as their inferiors. This is one way in which the loss of Upanayana brought about degradation of Shudras. Without Upanayana, a person was doomed to social degradation, to ignorance, and to poverty. The stoppage of Upanayana was the most deadly weapon discovered by the Brahmins to avenge themselves against the Shudras. It had the effect of an atomic bomb. Consider the combined effect of two facts. One, the Brahmins' exclusive right to officiate at an Upanayana. And two, the penalties to which he is made liable for performing an unauthorized Upanayana. The combined effect of these two factors was to vest in the Brahmin the power of performing as well as denying Upanayana. On the side of Brahmins, it is evidence that Shudras' pretensions to social superiority and their claim for special privilege had become outrageous in character and unbearable in extent. On the side of the Kshatriya kings, they could not be supposed to be willing to take these things lying low. How could they? It must not be forgotten that the most of the Kshatriya kings who came into conflict with the Brahmins belonged to the solar line. They differed from the Kshatriyas of the lunar line in learning, in pride, and in martial spirit. The Kshatriyas from the solar line, they challenged the Brahmins. The latter succumbed to them and became their slaves. The Kshatriyas belonging to the solar line were not merely the equals of Brahmins in the matter of learning, they were their superiors. Several of them were the authors of Vedic hymns and were known as Raj Rishis. And this was particularly true of those who came into conflict with Brahmins. The Kshatriyas were the leaders among the Vedic hymn makers. The most famous Vedic hymn, namely the Gayatri Mantra, is the production of Vishwamitra, who was a Kshatriya. It was impossible for the Kshatriyas of this caliber not to take up the challenge of the Brahmins. Their pride, which was born out of their prowess and their learning, must have been so greatly wounded by the pretensions of the Brahmins that when they did take up the challenge of the Brahmins, they did it in a ruthless spirit. In the times of the Rig Veda, Brahmins were a class by themselves. They had developed class consciousness and were keen on maintaining class interest. In that event, it would have been difficult for the Shudras to break up the conspiracy of the Brahmins. In the first place, did the Shudras realize what the effect of the loss of Upanayan was going to be on their future status? I'm sure they did not. Secondly, were the Kshatriyas a united body of people? I doubt if they were. Thirdly, had the other Kshatriya kings any sympathy for the Shudras? There was not much love lost between the Shudras and other non-Shudra Kshatriyas. Taking all these circumstances into consideration, there is nothing strange if the Shudras suffered the denial of Upanayana by the Brahmins to be a fact. Dr. Ambedkar says this thesis may be summarized as follows. 1. Shudras were one of the Aryan communities of the solar race. 2. Shudras ranked as Kshatriya Varna in the Indo-Aryan society. 3. There was a time when Aryan society recognized only three Varnas, namely Brahmins, Kshatriya, and Vaishya. The Shudras were not a separate Varna, but a part of Kshatriya Varna. 4. There was a continuous feud between the Shudra kings and Brahmins in which the Brahmins were subjected to many tyrannies and indignities. 5. As a result of the hatred towards Shudras due to their tyrannies and oppressions, the Brahmins refused to invest the Shudras with the sacred thread. 6. Owing to the loss of the sacred thread, the Shudras became socially degraded, fell below the rank of Vaishyas, and came to form the fourth Varna. This is where the book ends. Well, friends, we can conclude this session here. But before I leave, let me remind you, if you like this podcast series, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe to it. So long until we meet again. Thank you. Namaskar.